Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second video. I'm Dr. Josie Sarata. I am coming to you from Prickly Pear Therapy and Training and have partnered with TCFV to bring you this series of wellness videos, of organizational wellness videos, and I'm excited to be with you today. Although I will be by myself today, that's okay. We're going to have a good time together. I'm going to share with you today's content is around context for wellness and some definitions of terms. So when we were thinking of this series, we thought it would be most helpful if we could break up the content for you and have several videos instead of one big long one. So today's video is you're watching is if you're really interested in understanding more of the context for why we have this series and why we think wellness and the movement is so important. And also, we're going to share some definitions of terms, some terms that we thought were important for everyone to have shared understanding and shared knowledge of. Now, remember, we will have a tip sheet. And so in the tip sheet, you'll have links to lots of resources and some more definitions. But these are the ones that we thought we'd share today just to get us on the same page. So as I said, I'm Dr. Josephine Serrata, and I'm with Prickly Pear Therapy and Training. We are an organization in Austin, Texas. We provide mental health services. And also, we do a lot of organizational consulting and organizational support to support organizations like yours who are interested in organizational wellness, maybe some systems change work, all in the service of survivors. As you know, and you met in the other videos, I'm working in partnership with Molly and Jen from TCFE, and the three of us are available for any follow-up questions or appointments that you might want to schedule to get, if any of this information is intriguing and you'd like to work with us more closely, please feel free to reach out. And on the final video, you'll see, the final slide, you'll see our contact information. So why is context important? And so when we were planning this video series, we really thought that we would incorporate this one just to take a pause, just to give us some time to really share our understanding for why the interconnection between self-care and organization culture is inseparable. So oftentimes there is a critique or a pushback around the self-care movement, very justified, around what we'll hear often the notions of, my organization is asking me to practice self-care. However, the organizational culture really isn't supportive of it. So for example, I might not be able to use my time for mental health days, or I might not have flexible, support work hours and to allow me to actually take the time that I need to practice self-care. And so the interconnection between self-care, radical self-care, as we describe in another video, and organizational culture is inseparable. So we offer this series. We have, a couple videos for the individual. If you yourself want to learn about ways you can increase your own wellness and your own self-care. But also we have a video for organization managers, organization leaders, to really think through elements of organizational cultures that are making it difficult for us to practice pause and to prioritize our own health and mental health in doing this work. So we really acknowledge that you cannot promote self-care within an organization without also reviewing and adapting systems for wellness. So looking at the systems, looking at policies, procedures, work culture, or culture, what are things that might be happening that aren't conducive to centering self-care and radical self-care for our colleagues. We have all been through and we are in this thing of the pandemic, and it's really highlighted for us the need. I think for many of us, it was a pause of wait, we had to shift so many things. We had to be home in lockdown. Many of us had to figure out how to transition our work days to 100% virtual. Now many are in a hybrid model, but many of us, it gave us an opportunity to take a pause and really look at our relationship with productivity, with self-care, with wellness. I know for me, it gave me pause to transition a few things, especially around childcare and my connection with my children, because that really shifted when we had to be in lockdown together. But some of the things that I learned during the pandemic, I've tried to carry through in terms of pausing more often. I'm looking at my schedule and taking more breaks and figuring out how to spend more time with family. So those are some things, for example, that have come up for individuals, and for you yourself, you may have had to also do this journey of pausing and seeing, reflecting on your relationship with work and productivity. We also understand that context is important because there is a need for a cultural relevant lens in the work that we do and all of the work that we do. And especially when we're thinking of radical self-care and self-care, we talk about in that presentation around the history of our country specifically and its relationship with workforce, and especially for BIPOC individuals or individuals from underserved communities, the way that our bodies have been used in different workforces, right? And the culture of high performance and the culture of just work. And so really thinking of this as a systems change and a way to push back against some of these traumas in terms of high workloads and how we show up for work, excuse me, and high performance. And so this allows us to also think of it in those ways of how are we providing support to our culturally diverse colleagues and workforce in a way that that tries to change and shift some of these dynamics that we are all in and we all experience. So we believe that organizations are alive. Organizations are mechanisms that are adaptable, just like us as individuals are influenced by historical and contextual factors, are influenced by, current stress factors, natural disasters, right? We've experienced several of them in the last few years. Organizations are also influenced by these things, just like we are, just like our individual and our families are. Organizations can feel the stress and the tension of these changes, and organizations have their own histories and their own context for why they were formed, what their missions and values are, right? Organizations are alive. They can experience stress and trauma just as individuals do. And so what we're really hoping here is that you can think of the organization as an entity, right? And really start to build language for how organizations, just like us, just like our own nervous systems and how we react to stress and trauma, organizations do as well. And the hope is that we can start to build language to understand, okay, just like we do for ourselves, what's happening, right? Observe, identify, and then try to move through, right, the stress response. And so in the Radical Self-Care video, you hear us talk about nervous system response and how disassociation, disconnection can happen to us as individuals. And it can also spread through an organization where you'll have teams not talking to one another, or feeling a sense of distrust or disconnection, or just folks feeling like they're just going through the status quo, not really connected with their work or with their colleagues. These are all signs of organizational stress and trauma. again, very natural symptoms of experiencing prolonged stress and trauma. The good thing is that organizations just like us can build resilience in our nervous systems. We can learn skills. We can reactivate different neural pathways in our brains to help us grow and understand differently, to build our own internal resilience and buffer stress and trauma. So just like we can build skills as individuals, our organizations can too. And so we're hoping to introduce some of those concepts today. Again, this is just the introduction, and we are more than happy to provide more context and more detailed information. So the larger context for the field of domestic violence is really important for us to take a pause and kind of think through what are some of the contextual factors that can be impacting our organizations. So we know that sometimes organizations can replicate systems of power and control similar to the systems that we're attempting to work against. And many a times this is very common, and this happens again if we're just functioning and working and doing the status quo and not taking time as an organization to pause, to reflect, to observe, right? To think through what is happening within our system. How might we be having systems of power and control unintentionally? Again, we are all in larger contexts of racism, all the isms, capitalism, and a lot of these things we internalize again without it's not real intent, and then we might play out some of these dynamics. And so really as an organization, taking a minute to think through. So for example, we might have dynamics within our organization that really uplift white supremacy without even realizing that, right? And so white supremacy is really has some features, and some of here are some examples around being very individualistic, prioritizing the individual success over that of the collective, not honoring diversity, really wanting everyone to have the same thought process for how we perceive our work with survivors or the experiences of survivors, and really not honoring or uplifting even differences and how differences are beautiful and actually contribute to an or workforce and organization, the likelihood to be more perfectionistic, and some folks will feel like they have a pressure to perform, and to constantly be on in these roles, rather than having a learning environment, for example, where mistakes are inevitable. We're going to support each other through those and have systems in place for checks and balances in a supportive way. A perfectionist way, and a restrictive way feels very restrictive. Productivity over people or numbers, right? Constantly asking about numbers, but not necessarily checking in with the folks who are delivering those numbers, right? With the teams who are providing the services. And then scarcity and urgency culture. We hear that quite a lot, where it feels like there's always a sense of everything's urgent, everything's in crisis. And this is a very common thing, especially in the context of domestic violence, because we are in the work of trauma and crisis. And so you might have that constant sense and feeling of urgency. You wake up and, there's your to-do list and you've got to do it now, or this over sense of like rescuing, that I have to be the one to get all these things done and to support the survivor and their families, or no one else can, right? So that sense trickles down to the individual, but we're not even aware. Again, many of these things, we're not even aware of these dynamics that are happening in our organizations, which is kind of working as if. And so for our field, it's really important for us to take a pause to understand the context of doing trauma-informed work, where our workforce is overrepresented by survivors and members of underserved communities. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing because it shows for someone who's on their healing journey. Judith Herman, in an old book around trauma, very original books that came out documenting trauma and trauma-informed care, talks about the journey of survivor in their healing journey. And I think she broke it down to stages. And one of the later stages is wanting to give back, wanting to, get to a place where you feel empowered, you feel good about where you're at in your healing journey, and wanting to give back to your community and other survivors. So that's a beautiful thing about our field, is that there is a place for survivors, for survivor leaders, to join our organizations and to become advocates, to become mentors, to become case managers, therapists, all of that, right? To become leaders in our organizations. What that creates is a unique context for needing to be mindful of that within our organization. So then how are we really walking our talk and supporting survivors who are now part of our organization, providing services, providing support? How are we making sure our organizational culture is truly trauma-informed and culturally responsive? Our organizations are very overrepresented, which is beautiful, of underserved communities. Again, individuals who are committed to their communities, have that collectivism within their cultures, find themselves in our field because they feel aligned with our missions and our values of our organizations. And what are the organizations doing to make sure the org culture is in alignment or uplifts their cultures and is in service of them, versus maybe making them feel othered or less than. So that those two components are huge. And what we see is, within the field of domestic violence, we started grassroots, right? With feminists opening their doors, neighbors, vecinas, opening the doors to people, to survivors, to their children, to come in and provide support. And then over the years, what we have seen is more our field becoming more professionalized, moving away from peer support models, which have been huge for the domestic violence field, and less grassroots led, and being at the mercy of funding sources, right? Where funding folks determine what services we provide. And so it takes it away from really grassroots and the community of survivors being the leaders in our field, and being the ones who really lead and spearhead the work and how we do it. And so these are things for us just to take pause. Maybe you can work with an outside consultant, TCFE, myself, folks like me, who can help you take pause, who can help you do organizational assessments to help you kind of see where are some areas that you might want to shift to be more in alignment with your mission and your values as an organization. So we're going to go into some terminology. And again, these terms will be on our tip sheet, which you'll find along with the other videos. But we thought we wanted to make sure that we shared some of these definitions so that we're all on the same page in these videos as you hear them come up, because you'll hear some of these terms come up. So you'll hear trauma-informed approach. I already said it. Trauma-informed care, right? Those terms are used interchangeably. Now, trauma, we are in the field of trauma. Domestic violence organizations, sexual assault organizations are the leaders of this work. The term came from SAMHSA, from larger entities starting to come together and seeing the importance of organizations to really shift towards this approach. But I do want to acknowledge domestic violence organizations have been doing this work for decades. And just now, though, maybe, have the term now that we can use to describe how we do this work. And it also helps us now that researchers have taken it and really have fleshed it out and articulated it more. It really has helped us to understand what are the components of trauma-informed approaches. There is a tool that I was lucky enough to be involved in helping create, along with Lisa Goodman and other researchers. That is a trauma-informed practices scale, and it allows you to see the different areas of trauma-informed approaches for domestic violence organizations and kind of assess where you're at. And that will be one of the tools that we'll add. But this approach really involves the organization, everyone within the organization having an understanding of the complexities of the impact of trauma on survivors and those who serve survivors, right? And so that everyone has shared language, from the person at the receptionist at the front door to, when they're exiting out of your programs, that everyone in the organization is mindful of how trauma shows up. And this requires a lot of intentionality and work, because this is an entire field, right? As you know, for us to learn. And what's beautiful is that more and more research and information, collective knowledge is being shared around how to respond to trauma, how to understand trauma, how to make space for it. And so this is an approach with intentionality that organizations are really doing some work. And most domestic violence organizations, although we might have our approaches and our shared understanding, might decide to go on a journey to make sure that we're really aligned with this approach. And so some of the principles of trauma-informed approach is safety, trust, peer support, collaboration, choice, empowerment, really taking, like we mentioned, the context of culture and historical identity, responsiveness. So being responsive, affirming to diversity, to diverse realities, to culture, right, is a component of being trauma-informed. The other definition that we wanted to make sure to share, which we use often, is around historical trauma. Now, this is the cumulative emotional, psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, really emanating from massive group trauma. So this term really comes out of the indigenous communities coining this term to have a term to acknowledge the shared experience of colonization and how this impact continues to show up across generations, over the lifespan. Research is starting to show genetically how trauma shows up from one generation to the next, right, depending on trauma exposure, and how this happens at a massive level. And so this is a really important term for us to understand around historical trauma, that historically some communities have experienced trauma at mass levels. And even though the generations might be 2 or 3 generations removed, right, quote unquote, removed from that original trauma like colonization, we still know that the lingering effects of trauma are still present. The other similar term that we hear quite a bit along these lines is intergenerational trauma. And this is when the descendants of someone who has experienced trauma really experience the effects, or show up with the emotional and behavioral effects of trauma, the passing of trauma from generation to generation. More research is starting to show the genetics and how this actually shows up in our genetic makeup from an individual who is, say, pregnant and experiences domestic violence, and the child in their womb is born with a different nervous system than the child of who was in the womb of someone who did not experience domestic violence, right? And so the genetics is showing that this is an actual, our nervous systems look different depending on trauma exposure across generations. So this is key. Trauma is passed down. Resilience is too, but trauma is passed down. Now, complex trauma is, trauma that has you've experienced multiple traumatic events and different traumatic events, mostly usually starting and stemming in childhood. And these are really important. These are interpersonal in nature, right? So you hear a lot around, you might hear survivors talk about their own families having had been through domestic violence, poverty, collective trauma, and then they find themselves also experiencing these dynamics in interpersonal relationships, and a lot of this comes from complex trauma exposure early on, and over long periods of time. Just like it changes our genetics, it can change the dynamics for how we relate to other individuals and put us at increased likelihood of experiencing different forms of trauma throughout our lifespan. So complex trauma is a really important term to understand. And sometimes it's used interchangeably with developmental trauma, but there are lots of different resources around this particular trauma and how the interpersonal piece shows up, which we know domestic violence, family violence is interpersonal in nature. And so when we're trying to connect with survivors and we might feel like, it's something we can't quite connect interpersonally, we can look to complex trauma to understand what might be happening. Another term is called collective or community trauma, and this is the impact of traumatic events on a community or individuals with a shared identity. Now, many of us have experienced natural disasters, the pandemic being one of them. The pandemic fell into a category of a natural disaster, and so this was a collective trauma that we all experience. We know in Texas, for example, we experienced Hurricane Harvey, and many of our family violence, domestic violence shelters were impacted in those areas. That was a community trauma that community experienced, and the organizations, along with their community members, were going through that natural disaster and the recovery efforts. And so the workforce of the advocates and the people who worked in these organizations were experiencing compounded trauma because they were navigating how to survive for their own families, but then maybe also in shelter trying to help support the survivors in shelter, to make sure that everyone was safe, right? And so this shared experience of community or collective trauma. A term that we often hear in our field is around secondary or vicarious trauma, the emotional effects of witnessing the trauma of others. And so this is where the work we do in the field of domestic violence, family violence, sexual assault, where we are witness to traumatic events, where we are witness to some of the most difficult times of individuals' lives and the impact it has for just witnessing, for just bearing witness. It does have an impact. So some of us might like to pretend or think that it does not, but our nervous systems talk to each other. And so when we are in a room with an individual who's significantly dysregulated or experiencing severe mental illness, our nervous systems are taking that in, are being impacted, are getting dysregulated. And so it's important for us to honor and acknowledge that this is a thing for us. And first step is just acknowledging, identifying, so then we can move into thinking of like how to take care of ourselves. And the conversation around radical self-care in the other video will help give some ideas around that. So 2 other terms we want to make sure that we cover that are important for us that we use often in these presentations is around burnout. So burnout can be described by depersonalization, exhaustion, difficulty in doing one's job. It can feel like you're hopeless and just feel like you're not doing your job good. You're having a hard time coping with your workload, or it just feels different than when maybe you first started. Maybe you were rejuvenated and excited, and then you've noticed over time that's just really hard for you to get up and get to work. And so this can be associated with high workloads. Maybe if you really notice, like you feel like you don't get the support that you need in your work environment. And you just feel like not going to work anymore. And you still just don't, you're just going to show up and you feel like you're hopeless. You don't you're like, I don't know how to help you, right? If you start to see that kind of showing up for yourself, that's a good example. It's a good indicator for yourself to pause and see, you know what, I might be experiencing burnout. How can I communicate that? How can I accept that for myself? How can I communicate that to my team, my supervisors? What is my plan here? And then the last term is secondary traumatic stress. This is a form of occupational stress. It's described as job-related exposure to clients who have experienced extremely stressful and traumatic events. It's sometimes described as an occupational version of PTSD. It's a reaction to work that involves difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts, right? So on the previous slide, we talked about secondary vicarious trauma, right? The emotional effects. This is when we start to slip into seeing symptoms, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts or images, avoiding reminders of client traumatic experiences. So this is really, these are our signs of PTSD that I know that I've had experiences in the past where I've had nightmares over some of the stories that I've bared witness to, or I myself might have my own traumas triggered and start having difficulties with sleep, intrusive thoughts, obsessive thinking. And so these are more when they start to become like the symptomology of PTSD. It's really important for us to pay attention to, again, to communicate these to ourselves, to our colleagues, to others, and then to shift and figure out what do we need, what support do we need to support us during these times. These are not things to be ashamed about. And we want to acknowledge that actually these are very much, unfortunately, can be the norm in the work that we do, because again, nothing about our individual weaknesses or anything that like that, but because of the work, the type of work that we do and the field that we're in, our commitment to survivors, our commitment to social justice and change and changing dynamics of violence in our larger society, right? These are kind of a given. And so thinking of it in terms of that way, we hope to help you for yourself if you're watching these as an individual, to start to think through and pause and reflect and think through maybe what might need to change for you to help you support yourself, and also for organizations to acknowledge that this is part of the work that we do. So then what can we do to build in mechanisms in our organizations or cultures to really support our individuals, support our team, support our community members, support the survivors within our organizations that are here doing this very difficult work. Again, all in service of survivors and in uplifting our communities and making them better. So feel free to reach out to us. Here are our email addresses. Like I said, I'm Dr. Josephine Serrata, and I have partnered with Molly and Jen on this video series. We really will encourage you all to engage with us, to reach out to us. I'm always happy to set up coffee time, a cafecito coffee time to connect and talk. And then we're available for technical assistance and support and trainings and capacity building. If any of these topics are important to you and that you like to engage in more, these videos are just a surface, just an introduction, but hopefully they can help encourage you to support yourself, support your team, support your organization. Take care.